Imagine you're earning $60,000 a year, looking to build wealth, pay down debt, and maybe even create some room for investments. You stumble upon the 70-20-10 rule, which sounds simple and easy. Allocate 70% of your income to living expenses, 20% to savings and investments, and the remaining 10% for debt repayment or donations. But here's the harsh truth. The 70-20-10 rule may be more harmful than helpful, especially if you're trying to achieve financial freedom. I am going to uncover the 9 hidden pitfalls of this budgeting approach and why following it could slow down or even block your financial goals. Make sure to like and subscribe for more financial tips and strategies. It also helps with the algorithm. Now first, let's break down what 70% of a $60,000 salary looks like in real life. If you're making $60,000 a year, your take-home pay after taxes is roughly $48,000, depending on your deductions and where you live. 70% of that would mean around $33,600 annually, or $2,800 a month is going toward living expenses. Now let's consider what falls under living expenses for most people. Rent or mortgage, utilities, groceries, transportation, and maybe some discretionary spending for entertainment or eating out. In many cities, rent alone can easily consume $1,500 or more, leaving you just $1,300 for everything else. This may seem doable, but if you're spending the majority of your income just to keep up with basic needs, there's little room left for wealth-building activities. Here's where the problem begins. By allotting such a high percentage to living expenses, the 70-20-10 rule traps you in a cycle of maintaining, not growing. Financial growth requires margin, meaning extra funds that can be redirected into assets that appreciate over time. With 70% tied up in expenses, you're left with little flexibility to make meaningful progress. Take, for example, someone who wants to invest in real estate. To get started, they'd need to save for a down payment, which could be $20,000 or more. But under this rule, accumulating such an amount would take years, making the goal feel distant, if not entirely out of reach. Instead of creating financial room, this rule can keep you from ever getting a true foothold. The second reason the 70-20-10 rule falls short is that it assumes a static lifestyle. The reality is that costs vary significantly, especially as we encounter new life stages and needs. Think about healthcare expenses, which can spike without warning, or the need to upgrade skills or education to remain competitive in a shifting job market. Someone earning $60,000 might find that they need $5,000 for a professional certification course, but with only 20% allocated to savings and investments, there's not enough flexibility in this rule to account for such opportunities. This lack of adaptability locks you into a rigid structure, which is the last thing you want when managing finances. Another downside is that this rule doesn't encourage aggressive debt repayment. 10% may sound like a reasonable amount to allocate toward debt if you're only looking at minimum payments. But what if you have student loans, credit card debt, or a car loan with high interest? For someone with $10,000 in credit card debt at a 20% interest rate, paying just 10% of your income, or around $4,800 a year, barely scratches the surface once interest is compounded. You end up losing more money to interest than if you were able to prioritize debt repayment aggressively. Rather than helping you tackle debt head-on, the 70-20-10 rule can prolong it, costing you thousands in the long run and potentially lowering your credit score. Here's another crucial flaw. There's no allowance for growth-oriented investment. With only 20% of your income going towards savings and investments, building a diverse portfolio is nearly impossible. For example, to max out a Roth IRA, you need to contribute $6,500 a year. If you're following the 70-20-10 rule on a $60,000 salary, it's almost impossible to meet this contribution limit without sacrificing other aspects of your budget. This limitation prevents you from fully utilizing tax-advantaged accounts or exploring other high-yield opportunities, which could fast-track your financial goals. Instead of preparing you for future financial independence, the rule limits your ability to leverage compounding interest, which is one of the most powerful tools in wealth building. Now consider how inflation impacts this rule. When you're only saving 20% of your income, any fluctuation in the economy can drastically affect your financial stability. Inflation eats away at the purchasing power of the money you've saved, which means that the 20% you thought was secure is gradually losing its value. For instance, if inflation rates hit 3% annually, the value of your 20% savings shrinks year after year, making it harder to maintain your standard of living, let alone reach your financial goals. To truly safeguard against inflation, your budget needs a higher allocation for investments that outpace inflation, something the 70-20-10 rule doesn't support. The fifth reason the 70-20-10 rule is ineffective lies in its approach to discretionary spending. Allocating 70% of your income to living expenses might seem to cover both essential and non-essential items, but this can easily lead to lifestyle creep. For example, if you're spending that full 70% without differentiating between needs and wants, it's tempting to justify expenses like dining out, streaming subscriptions, or clothing splurges because they fit within that broad percentage. Over time, these discretionary choices can add up, limiting your ability to save or invest more aggressively. Instead of encouraging frugality, the rule can unintentionally promote overspending within the 70%, leaving little for future-oriented goals. Another drawback is that the rule doesn't adjust for income growth. Imagine you get a raise and your salary jumps to $70,000. If you continue following the 70-20-10 rule, your spending also increases proportionally. This traps you into a spending pattern that rises with your income, preventing you from capturing the full benefit of earning more. Ideally, you would maintain a similar level of expenses while increasing your savings and investments. But the 70-20-10 rule doesn't account for this growth strategy. Instead of fostering wealth accumulation as your income rises, it encourages a static allocation that can lead to higher spending habits. Consider too the way this rule disregards the critical role of an emergency fund. In today's financial landscape, having a dedicated emergency fund, enough to cover at least 3 to 6 months of expenses, is non-negotiable for true financial security. With only 20% allocated to savings and investments under the 70-20-10 model, building an emergency fund can take years, especially if part of that savings is also going toward investment goals or retirement accounts. Imagine the stress of facing a sudden job loss or an unexpected medical expense with no substantial cushion to fall back on. By spreading your budget too thin, the rule compromises your financial safety net, putting you at greater risk of needing to take on debt when emergencies arise. The 70-20-10 rule also completely overlooks the benefits of aggressive investing at an early age. The power of compounding works best when you start early and invest heavily in high-return assets. If you're in your 20s or 30s, setting aside only 20% for investments significantly dampens the potential growth of your portfolio. For instance, by contributing only 20% of your income, you miss out on the compounding effects that could have potentially doubled or even tripled your investment by the time you reach retirement age. Imagine the difference if, instead, you dedicated 30% or even 40% of your income toward investments in your prime earning years. This strategy could make a profound difference to your financial stability, retirement options, and ability to afford the lifestyle you envision later in life. Finally, let's talk about the psychological impact of following a rigid rule like 70-20-10. Budgeting should empower you, giving you control over your finances and flexibility to adjust as needed. But strict adherence to this rule can lead to frustration, especially if unexpected expenses arise. Say you need $1,200 for an emergency car repair, but your budget only allows for $800 in discretionary funds this month. Following the rule might mean dipping into savings or even taking on debt to cover the shortfall. This creates stress and undermines the purpose of having a budget in the first place. A good budgeting plan adapts with you, allowing you to reallocate funds as priorities change, but the 70-20-10 rule lacks this flexibility, leading to feelings of restriction and financial stagnation. Instead of following the 70-20-10 rule, consider a more adaptable and customized approach to budgeting that aligns with your specific goals and financial circumstances. For someone making $60,000 a year, it might make more sense to follow a 60-30-10 rule or even a 50-40-10 if you're aiming for aggressive savings. This allows you to allocate a larger percentage towards savings and investments, accelerating your path to financial independence. But knowing all of this is for nothing if you don't know how to make the right decisions with your money. Watch the 15 frugal living habits to build wealth on your screen to find out now. Thanks for watching.